This courtroom is a place for real lawyers, kid. Go play at being an adult somewhere else." With those words, Judge Richard Calloway humiliated Elliot Graves, a mere 17-year-old, in front of a room full of seasoned attorneys and stunned spectators. What no one realized was that this kid wasn't just a lost student. He was a prodigy lawyer, ready to shock everyone in that courtroom. As muffled laughter rippled through the room, Elliot stood his ground, clutching his worn canvas backpack as if it held something far more valuable than just a few papers. The silence was broken by the sound of an envelope being placed on the bench. "Here are my credentials, Your Honor," Elliot said with a calmness that seemed almost impossible for someone his age. The judge took the documents with disdain, but as his eyes scanned the pages, his expression slowly began to change. The murmurs died down. The room, once filled with derision, now watched in absolute silence as Calloway's face hardened. No one had seen this coming. The soft rain falling outside seemed to echo the tension inside the courtroom. The sound of droplets tapping against the windows filled the air, interrupted only by the rustling of pages in the judge's hands. The attorneys exchanged uneasy glances, and even the defendant, who had been lounging with an air of superiority next to his defense lawyer, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Elliot, however, stood unwavering, as if this moment was one he had prepared for his entire life. And in truth, he had. From a young age, he knew he would have to fight harder than anyone else to be taken seriously. Judge Calloway took a deep breath and fixed his gaze on the boy standing before him. "Do you really think you can convince me that you're qualified to be here?" Elliot didn't flinch. "I'm not here to convince you, sir. I'm here to defend my client." The young man's firm, unshaken tone caused the judge to raise an eyebrow. There was something about him, something that couldn't be ignored. Across the room, Norman West, a veteran lawyer known for his ruthless tactics, folded his arms and smirked. To him, this was merely a sideshow, just another overconfident youth trying to prove himself. But soon, Norman would realize how very wrong he was. Elliot calmly opened his backpack and pulled out a thick dossier, placing it on the table with precise movements. "These are the documents that prove the misinterpretation of the will in question. I only ask that the court hear me out before making any judgments based on my appearance." Judge Calloway looked back down at the documents, and this time, there was no trace of sarcasm in his expression. The courtroom was about to witness something no one had anticipated. Judge Richard Calloway flipped through the documents slowly, each page turned, heightening the tension in the courtroom. The disbelief that had marked his face earlier began to shift into something more measured, almost concerned. Elliot stood firm, his hands pressed against the table, waiting. The silence was so profound that even the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway outside seemed overly loud. "Well, it appears you do have the right credentials." Calloway finally broke the silence, his voice lower now, as if he was still trying to process what he held in his hands. "But tell me, kid, how does someone like you pass the bar exam?" His tone carried the same sarcasm, but now there was a trace of genuine curiosity behind it. Elliot took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "Dedication, Your Honor. The law has always been my life. I've been preparing for this day since I was 12. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and the determination in his eyes was impossible to ignore. Norman West, the defense attorney, chuckled softly, crossing his arms. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this case is far too serious to be treated like some sort of school project." His voice carried the condescension of someone who believed himself far above any challenge. "Mr. Harris hired a teenager to represent him. The defense believes this hearing shouldn't even be taking place." Elliot turned slowly to face West. "With all due respect, sir, the law doesn't require gray hair to practice. It requires knowledge, preparation, and commitment. And I'm fully prepared to prove that here today." A faint murmur rippled through the room. Some attorneys exchanged surprised glances, while others simply watched with skepticism. This time, the judge didn't interrupt. He looked at West, then back at Elliot, carefully assessing the situation. "I decide what should or shouldn't proceed, Mr. West," Calloway said firmly, before turning his attention back to Elliot. "All right, kid. The floor is yours. Let's see if you truly deserve that title, or if this is just another case of youthful bravado. Elliot calmly opened his backpack and pulled out a neatly organized stack of documents, each page meticulously marked. He stepped forward and handed them to the court officer. These are the materials proving that Mr. Harris was harmed by the misinterpretation of the will. I had a forensic analysis conducted on the original document, and I've uncovered discrepancies that I intend to present. Calloway quickly skimmed a few of the pages, his eyes narrowing. Discrepancies, you say? And how exactly do you plan to prove this? Elliot stood his ground. I'll demonstrate it clearly using the clauses from the Civil Code and testimony from witnesses. I only ask for the opportunity to be heard. From the back of the room, Mr. Harris, a simple man with a worried expression, clutched his hat tightly in his hands, looking at Elliot with a mixture of hope and fear. To him, this case wasn't just a legal dispute, it was his life. Elliot understood this and felt the weight of that responsibility bearing down on him like a heavy stone. Judge Calloway studied the young lawyer for a long moment before letting out a deep sigh and leaning forward. All right, Graves, you've got your chance. But let me be clear, I don't tolerate mistakes. Elliot didn't blink. I won't disappoint you, Your Honor. The courtroom fell silent again, but this time, something had shifted. The audience was no longer dismissive. They were curious. They were ready to listen. And Elliot was ready to prove that no one should ever underestimate him. The ticking of the clock on the wall marked the passing seconds, but for Elliot Graves, each one felt heavier than the last. He knew the opportunity Judge Calloway had granted him was 1 in a million, and there was no room for error. With steady hands resting on the documents before him, he took a deep breath and began to speak. Your Honor, the original will of the late Mr. Howard Harris was subtly but significantly altered to benefit Mr. Norman West, the defendant's attorney. His voice was steady and clear, devoid of any hesitation. Judge Calloway's gaze sharpened, locking onto Elliot, while West, on the other side of the room, forced a sarcastic smile. This is absurd, West said, rising from his seat. Mr. Harris hired this child, and now he expects us to believe there was fraud? Your Honor, I request that we end this farce before any more time is wasted. Elliot ignored the interruption. He pulled a document from the pile and walked it over to the court officer, handing him a copy. This is the original will, signed by the late Mr. Harris 3 years ago. And this, he continued, holding out another paper, is the altered version, filed just 6 months ago. Calloway accepted the documents, his brow furrowing as he examined them. The entire courtroom watched his every move intently. The judge's eyes darted back and forth between the two papers, scrutinizing the signatures, dates, and subtle details. The only sound in the room was the creak of his chair as he leaned forward. Do you have any concrete evidence of forgery, Graves, or is this just speculation? The skepticism in the judge's tone was undeniable, but Elliot also caught a faint glimmer of curiosity. This was his moment. Your Honor, I enlisted a handwriting expert to analyze both documents. The forensic report identifies subtle differences in the signatures and writing strokes, indicating the newer version may have been tampered with. He gestured to the analysis included in the dossier. Additionally, we have testimony from a clerk at the records office who states that Mr. West was present the day the document was filed. Without the legitimate testator, West laughed loudly. Ridiculous. I've been practicing law longer than this boy has been alive. Elliot turned and looked directly at him. And perhaps that's exactly why you think you can do whatever you want. Judge Calloway raised his hand, silencing the exchange. That's enough. Mr. Graves, I'll allow you to continue your argument. But if I sense you're turning this hearing into a spectacle— Elliot didn't flinch. Your Honor, I'm not here to put on a show. I'm here to ensure justice is served. In the back of the room, Mr. Harris clasped his hands tightly, trying to calm his nerves. To him, Elliot was his last hope. For months, he'd been deceived and pressured by the defense, buried under complicated legal jargon and endless bureaucratic roadblocks that kept him from what was rightfully his. Seeing this young man, with his unassuming appearance, stand up to all of it with such conviction filled his heart with a cautious optimism. West, sensing that the judge was beginning to entertain Elliot's argument, shifted tactics. Your Honor, this boy is taking technicalities and spinning them into a conspiracy theory. If we allow this to continue, we'll waste valuable time on baseless speculation. Calloway took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Elliot. I want to see where this goes. Elliot knew he'd carved out a small window of opportunity, but there was still a long road ahead. He braced himself for his next move, aware that every word he uttered in that courtroom was a battle, and he couldn't afford to lose a single one. Elliot could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. He knew that presenting evidence wasn't enough. He had to convince people who, from the very beginning, doubted him. Judge Calloway watched him intently, his fingers drumming slowly on the desk, as if testing the young lawyer's patience. So, Mr. Graves, the judge's firm voice broke the tension. Are you implying that an official document was forged? Elliot held his breath for a moment before responding. I'm not implying, Your Honor. I'm stating it. The evidence is clear, and every detail shows that Mr. Harris was unjustly deprived of his inheritance. Norman West shook his head with a smug smile. With all due respect, Your Honor, this boy is playing with fire. We're here to resolve a serious case, not waste time on detective stories. The courtroom seemed divided. Some whispered among themselves, while others remained silent, trying to decide if Elliot was truly capable or just a lost kid in a place where he didn't belong. But Elliot knew exactly what he was doing. He had spent years studying this case, examining every line, every signature, every minute detail. He turned to the judge, his voice steady but devoid of arrogance. Your Honor, if I may continue, I can demonstrate exactly how these alterations were made and who benefited from them. Calloway kept his eyes fixed on the boy. There was something about Elliot that was hard to ignore. He seemed far more mature than his age suggested, as though he carried a burden much greater than anyone else in the room could imagine. After a long silence, the judge gave a small wave of his hand. Proceed. Elliot picked up one of the documents and walked to a projection screen set up in the courtroom, displaying the two versions of the will. Notice the subtle differences, he began, pointing to the screen. Here, in the signature of the deceased, there's a slight tilt, something that wasn't present in the original document. This suggests the signature was artificially replicated. The judge narrowed his eyes, scrutinizing every detail. West, on the other hand, puffed impatiently. This is absurd. Surely, Your Honor, you're not seriously considering this. Elliot remained calm, but his voice carried unmistakable conviction. What's absurd is thinking you can deceive the justice system without being challenged. The statement echoed through the room, and murmurs erupted, louder this time. West's smug demeanor faltered, his expression darkening with irritation. At the back of the room, Mr. Harris watched Elliot with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. To him, this young lawyer was the only chance to reclaim what was rightfully his. Judge Calloway turned slowly to West. Tell me, Mr. West, if the original will is legitimate, why have so many different versions of it been submitted to the court in recent months? West opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. Elliot noticed the hesitation and pressed forward. Because the defense knows the original document doesn't favor Mr. Ramirez. That's why they attempted to manipulate it. The judge leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. Elliot, what exactly are you trying to prove here? Elliot glanced briefly at Mr. Harris before answering. I'm trying to prove that my client was deceived, exploited, and is now on the verge of losing what his father left him. The room fell silent. Even West, who had been cracking jokes moments ago, now appeared visibly uneasy. Elliot knew he had made an important breakthrough, but he also knew the case was far from one. He needed to stay sharp and continue proving that, despite his youth, he was more than ready for this battle. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses and glanced at the stack of documents on his desk. Very well, Mr. Graves. Continue. Elliot took a deep breath, ready to press forward. Elliot felt a cold bead of sweat slide down the back of his neck, but he didn't take his eyes off Judge Calloway. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. Every single person seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for his next move. Elliot knew he was close to dismantling the defense's charade, But he also understood that a single misstep could cost him everything. Taking a step forward, he kept his voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct your attention to this specific clause in the original will." Elliot projected the document onto the screen and circled a particular phrase. "Here, the testator explicitly states that the property should be inherited solely by my client, Mr. Harris. However, in the altered version, the language has been subtly modified to include a so-called redistribution of assets." Norman West leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers impatiently on the desk. "That doesn't prove anything. Changes in wording are common in revised wills." Elliot locked eyes with him. "With all due respect, Mr. West, revisions are common when done legally, not behind closed doors. My client never authorized this change, and we have witnesses who can confirm that." Judge Calloway flipped through the documents again, his expression stern, though the initial disdain he'd shown earlier was noticeably absent. He glanced at Elliot, then at West, as though weighing the arguments from both sides. "You have witnesses, Graves?" the judge asked, his tone carrying a slight challenge. Elliot walked back to his table and picked up another folder. "Yes, Your Honor. I call to the stand Mr. Robert Jenkins, a clerk at the records office who witnessed an attempt to alter the document without the consent of the rightful heir." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. West exchanged a quick, uneasy glance with his client, who now looked visibly uncomfortable. When Robert Jenkins, a gray-haired man with trembling hands, rose and made his way to the witness stand, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. "Mr. Jenkins," Elliot began, his voice calm and measured, "could you tell the court what you witnessed that day?" Jenkins cleared his throat before speaking. "I remember it well. Mr. West came into the office with a document already prepared and said he needed an urgent update. I found it odd because the testator wasn't present. When I asked about that, he assured me everything was in order. But it didn't feel right." West stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is pure speculation." Judge Calloway raised a hand to silence him. "The court will hear what the witness has to say." Elliot stepped closer, his voice steady yet firm. "Mr. Jenkins, did you verify the authenticity of the document?" "Yes," Jenkins said hesitantly. "And I noticed something was off about the signature. It looked similar, but it wasn't identical." A heavy silence fell over the room. Judge Calloway fixed West with an intense, questioning stare. "Mr. West, how do you explain this?" West cleared his throat, visibly flustered as he tried to maintain his composure. "This is a misunderstanding. There is nothing irregular about this will." Elliot didn't back down. "Your Honor, I request that this court authorize a more thorough forensic examination to confirm whether the signature was indeed forged. Mr. Harris has a right to know the truth before his inheritance is unjustly taken from him." The judge glanced at the documents again, letting out a deep breath. The weight of the decision was clear on his face. "I'm authorizing a detailed forensic analysis," he said finally. "Until then, no decisions regarding the transfer of the property will be made." Elliot clenched his fists under the table. It was his first concrete victory. Across the room, Mr. Harris bowed his head, discreetly wiping away a tear. For months, he had felt as though all hope was lost. But now, thanks to Elliot, a new glimmer of hope had emerged. West, on the other hand, was livid. He hadn't expected a kid to back him into a corner like this. The tension in the courtroom was almost tangible, and Elliot knew that from this moment on, the game had completely changed. The courtroom felt colder than before. Judge Calloway rested his chin on his hand, deep in thought, while Elliot Graves meticulously organized his papers. Across the room, Norman West kept his eyes fixed on the young lawyer, studying him like a predator sizing up its prey. Losing wasn't an option for West, not with so many watchful eyes on him. West rose slowly, adjusted his tie, and strode to the center of the room. "Your Honor," he began, his voice brimming with confidence, "we cannot base this case on mere insinuations." Despite his efforts, Mr. Graves has yet to provide concrete evidence of intentional fraud. He turned toward Elliot, his smile dripping with mockery. "And with all due respect, Your Honor, Relying solely on the word of a records clerk is hardly sufficient to discredit a legally registered document. Elliot knew West would try to undermine everything he had built so far. It wasn't a surprise. Taking a deep breath, he responded immediately, his tone steady and unwavering. Mr. West seems to forget that the handwriting analysis hasn't been completed yet. We're only beginning to uncover the truth behind this document. West chuckled softly, shaking his head. The truth? Mr. Graves, the truth is that this case is nothing more than a desperate attempt by your client to invalidate a legitimate will. He turned back to the judge. I request that the defense be allowed to conduct a counter-analysis, carried out by independent experts. Judge Calloway observed the exchange closely, leaning forward on his desk. He looked at Elliot. What do you say, Graves? Are you willing to have your evidence re-examined? Elliot met the judge's gaze without hesitation. If there's one thing I've learned, Your Honor, it's that the truth doesn't fear scrutiny. His straightforward response sparked murmurs among the audience. The judge hid a faint smile and gestured for the proceedings to continue. Realizing he wouldn't intimidate Elliot easily, West shifted tactics. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and slammed it onto the bench. All right, since we're so focused on uncovering the truth, I'd like to question this young lawyer's credibility. Elliot remained silent, his expression calm but focused. West turned to the audience, as if addressing a grander stage. He's only 17, Your Honor. He has no experience, no track record, and the very idea that he's standing here today is, frankly, absurd. From the plaintiff's bench, Mr. Harris gripped his knee anxiously, but Elliot stayed composed. The law requires competence, not age, Mr. West. And if you have an issue with my experience, I suggest you focus on the facts, not my appearance. The courtroom fell silent. West opened the folder before him and pulled out a stack of papers. Your Honor, I request permission to question Mr. Graves' qualifications. The judge studied West for a moment, then turned to Elliot. Are you ready for this, Graves? Elliot didn't falter. I've always been ready. West walked slowly to Elliot's table, holding the documents in one hand. If you're as qualified as you claim, then perhaps you could explain how you managed to graduate so young. How could someone your age possibly have enough knowledge to stand before this court? Elliot took a deep breath. This wasn't the first time he'd faced this question, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. I've spent years studying intensively, dedicating myself more than most in this room could imagine. While my peers were playing ball or going to parties, I was buried in law books. The sincerity in Elliot's voice caught Judge Calloway's attention. His gaze softened, becoming more thoughtful, as if he were reassessing the young man before him. West, however, wasn't ready to back down. So, you're telling me that talent and effort can replace real-world experience? Elliot looked him squarely in the eye. Talent and effort are more than enough to pursue justice, Mr. West. And that's exactly what we're doing here. West pressed his lips together, realizing he was losing ground. Judge Calloway cleared his throat, turning his focus back to the case. All right, that's enough. Let's return to the matter at hand. He picked up one of the documents Elliot had submitted, holding it up for the courtroom to see. Until proven otherwise, the question's signature raises serious doubts, and this court requires answers. The tension in the room surged once again. Elliot knew the real battle was only just beginning. The courtroom was steeped in a tension, so thick it felt almost tangible. Elliot Graves rose slowly from his chair, took a deep breath, and walked to the center of the room. Each step echoed on the wooden floor, mingling with the expectant silence of those present. Judge Calloway watched him with an inscrutable expression, while Norman West stood with his arms crossed, trying to mask his growing unease. Elliot stopped in front of the court, his gaze sweeping across the rows of attentive faces. He knew this was his moment to turn the case around, to prove that age had nothing to do with competence. Straightening the papers in front of him, he began to speak, but his voice came out strong and steady, needing no support from notes. Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen, this case isn't just about a will. It's about trust. It's about a man who trusted that his final wishes would be honored, only to be betrayed by those who were meant to protect them. He paused, letting his words hang in the air before continuing. My client, Mr. Harris, believed that justice always prevails. And today, we are here to prove that he was right. At the back of the room, Mr. Harris lowered his head briefly, visibly moved. His trembling hands clutched the worn hat he'd been holding since the hearing began. Elliot pressed on, turning his focus directly to Judge Calloway. All my life, people have told me I'm too young to understand certain things. But the truth is, justice has no age. It only requires courage. The room remained utterly silent. I'm not here to impress anyone, Your Honor. I'm here because I believe, with all my heart, that the truth matters. And that truth is written in these pages. He gestured toward the original will on the table. Norman West shifted in his seat, struggling to maintain his composure, though the impact of Elliot's words was undeniable. Judge Calloway cleared his throat, his fingers tapping lightly on the bench. Graves, are you suggesting that the entire defense is built on lies? Elliot drew in a steady breath, meeting Calloway's gaze with respect but no hesitation. I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that there is more to this story than what's being told, and my client deserves for every detail to be examined thoroughly. The room held its collective breath. West stood abruptly, desperate to regain control of the narrative. Your Honor, with all due respect, what we're hearing are emotional appeals, not concrete facts. What we need here is objectivity. Elliot turned to face him slowly. The truth is objective, Mr. West, and the documents prove it. Judge Calloway fell silent for a moment, observing the two lawyers carefully. Finally, he adjusted his papers and spoke in a more measured tone than before. This court will allow all facts to be heard. Proceed, Graves. Elliot's confidence was palpable. He turned to Mr. Harris and gave him a small nod, silently reassuring him that the fight was far from over. The weight of the moment was immense, but Elliot knew he was on the right path. West, on the other hand, finally seemed rattled. For the first time, he realized he was up against someone who, despite his youth, would not be easily intimidated. There was still a long road ahead in the courtroom, but one thing was clear. Elliot had earned the respect of everyone present. Elliot walked back to his seat with measured steps, though inside his heart was pounding. The silence in the courtroom was heavy, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Judge Calloway leafed through the documents with a focused gaze, his brows knit in deep concentration. Across the room, Norman West sat rigidly, his outward demeanor calm, though the subtle tapping of his fingers on the desk betrayed his restlessness. Mr. Harris, seated quietly on the plaintiff's bench, looked at Elliot with a mixture of anxiety and hope. His weary eyes, etched with the hardships of a life spent working tirelessly, carried a silent trust in the young lawyer. Yet, beneath that trust, there was an unmistakable fear. He had followed the rules his entire life, trusted the system, and now everything rested on the shoulders of this teenager who, despite his youth, seemed to bear the weight of an entire world. Calloway removed his glasses and rubbed his face, as if trying to organize the flood of thoughts swirling in his mind. All right, he said, his voice weary but firm. The matter presented by Mr. Graves is serious. I cannot ignore the evidence brought forth so far. However, he paused, fixing his gaze on Elliot, I'll need time to review this thoroughly. Elliot had anticipated this. He glanced at his client, offering a small gesture of reassurance. I expected this, he whispered, giving Harris a reassuring pat on the shoulder. It's not over yet. But West wasn't one to sit idly by. He stood and strode deliberately to the center of the room. Your Honor, with all due respect, prolonging this hearing is unnecessary. We have a legally registered document, and any claims against its validity are pure conjecture. Elliot took a deep breath before responding. The defense keeps leaning on formalities, Your Honor, but what's at stake here is more than just a piece of paper. It's my client's dignity. It's respect for his father's final wishes. Calloway's expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker in his eyes that showed Elliot's words had struck a chord. He tapped his fingers lightly on the bench, clearly in thought. Mr. West, the judge said, turning to the defense attorney, if your client's document is as legitimate as you claim, then there should be no reason to fear further investigation. West forced a tight-lipped smile, though his eyes betrayed his irritation. "Very well, Your Honor. But I request that the analysis be conducted without delay. My client is growing tired of this spectacle." Elliot kept his composure. "With all due respect, Your Honor, my client is tired as well. Tired of being deceived." The exchange echoed across the courtroom, and Calloway leaned forward, exhaling deeply. "I will conduct my review and issue a decision tomorrow morning. Until then, this hearing is adjourned." The sound of the gavel reverberated through the room as people began to stir, murmuring among themselves. Elliot felt the weight of the pending decision settle heavily on his shoulders. Every detail mattered, and he knew he couldn't afford to falter. As he gathered his papers, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Mr. Harris stood beside him, his tired face lit with a small but genuine smile. "Thank you, Elliot. No one has ever fought for me like this before." Elliot returned the smile faintly. "We still have work to do, Mr. Harris. I won't let them take this away from you." Across the room, Norman West watched Elliot closely, his expression unreadable but serious. He wouldn't admit it out loud, but he knew that this young lawyer was different, and that difference was unsettling. The clock on the wall read just before 9 a.m. when Elliot Graves entered the courtroom, his expression serious yet resolute. The room was already packed. Mr. Harris, seated in the front row, kept his hands clasped in his lap, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench. He looked even more tired than the night before, but the glimmer of hope in his eyes remained. On the other side of the room, Norman West adjusted his tie while speaking in hushed tones to his client. His usual confidence was still apparent, though now tinged with a faint impatience. Elliot took in every detail, every expression, carefully observing the atmosphere. He knew this was the decisive moment. When Judge Calloway entered the courtroom, the murmurs ceased instantly. His expression was grim and serious as he carried the final forensic report in his hands. The silence was almost tangible as he took his seat and arranged the papers in front of him. After reviewing all the evidence presented and the forensic analysis of the documents, Calloway began, his tone measured and deliberate. "This court has reached a conclusion." Elliot held his ground, his posture firm, though his heart raced in his chest. Mr. Harris closed his eyes briefly, as though offering a silent prayer. Calloway looked out at the room before continuing. "The forensic analysis has confirmed that the signature on the will registered 6 months ago contains irregularities indicative of possible forgery. Furthermore, the testimony of the clerk from the records office has raised serious questions about the credibility of the defense." Norman West crossed his arms, his expression stony as he worked to mask his frustration. His client hung his head, avoiding the gaze of the room. Elliot took a deep breath, keeping his expression steady, though relief coursed through him. The judge's voice rang out, firm and authoritative. "In light of this evidence, this court declares that the document submitted by the defense is invalid, and that Mr. Harris is the rightful heir to the assets outlined in the original will." For a moment, no one moved. The weight of the judge's words lingered in the air, as though they needed time to fully sink in. Then, a quiet sigh of relief escaped Mr. Harris, and his eyes filled with tears. Elliot closed his eyes for a brief second, allowing himself to feel the victory, but quickly turned his attention to his client. Mr. Harris looked at him, his face a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "You did it, kid, you did it," he whispered, gripping Elliot's hand tightly. Norman West gathered his papers slowly, sparing a quick glance at Elliot. Without a word, he stood and left the courtroom, his rigid posture failing to conceal his defeat. Judge Calloway struck the gavel one final time. Case closed. Elliot stood beside Mr. Harris, feeling the immense weight of everything that had led to this moment. This wasn't just a legal victory. It was proof that he belonged here, that his dedication and perseverance had not been in vain. Outside the courtroom, the air felt lighter. Mr. Harris wiped his tears as he clutched the document in his trembling hands. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," he said, his smile full of emotion. Elliot placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and replied simply, "Justice always finds a way, Mr. Harris." As people left the courtroom, murmuring about the case and the young lawyer who had defied all expectations, Elliot looked out at the horizon. He knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. The afternoon sun spilled across the busy city streets, reflecting off the windows of buildings and softly illuminating the courthouse where Elliot Graves had just claimed his first major victory. He walked alongside Mr. Harris, who clutched the official document in his still trembling hands. "I don't know how to thank you, son," Harris said, his voice thick with emotion. "That land, it was all I had left of my father. I thought I'd never get it back." Elliot looked at him with a gentle smile. "You don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone should do for someone who deserves justice." They walked in silence for a moment. Elliot's eyes wandered to the people around them, some rushing by, others lost in their own thoughts. He couldn't help but wonder how many of them had been wronged, how many had lost something important because they didn't have someone to stand up for them. Across the street, Norman West emerged from the courthouse, his expression dark. He paused briefly and glanced in Elliot's direction. In his eyes, there was a mix of frustration and, perhaps, a flicker of respect. West adjusted his tie, gave a faint nod, and walked away without a word. Elliot watched him leave, knowing that this wouldn't be the last adversary he'd face. When they arrived at Mr. Harris's modest home, they were greeted by his middle-aged daughter, who threw her arms around Elliot in a warm embrace, tears streaming down her face. "My father never gave up," she said, gripping Elliot's hand tightly. "And you didn't give up on him." "Thank you." Elliot smiled faintly, but inside, he felt something deeper. He knew he'd done the right thing, but he also knew there was still much to prove. That night, lying in bed, Elliot pulled out an old photograph tucked inside a book. It was of his mother, a woman with kind eyes and a tired smile. He remembered the sleepless nights he'd spent studying while she worked late to support the two of them. "I hope you're proud of me, Mom," he whispered. The next morning, when Elliot arrived at his small office, he found a stack of letters and notes left by people who had heard about his victory. Some were asking for help, while others simply wanted to congratulate him. But one letter stood out. It was from a young law student who wrote, "Elliot, your story inspired me. I always thought it would be impossible for someone like me to make it in law, but after hearing about you, I feel like I have a chance. Thank you for showing us that age doesn't define who we are." Elliot held the letter for a moment, reflecting on the impact his actions were having. He realized his work extended far beyond the courtroom. He had the ability to inspire and help so many more people. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the phone and made a call. "Hello, Dr. Stevens? I've been thinking about starting a mentorship program for young lawyers. I believe we could create something meaningful." The response on the other end was enthusiastic, and Elliot knew he was on the brink of something greater. As he gazed out the window, he saw Mr. Harris sitting on a bench in the nearby park, smiling peacefully as he watched the birds. In that moment, Elliot understood that true victory wasn't just about winning in court. It was about creating real change in people's lives. Have you ever been underestimated but proved everyone wrong? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it.